Hey everybody, welcome to our YouTube video where we're going to discuss the two most misapplied or misinterpreted cues when we're doing either functional movements or just movements within our fitness routine. So the first cue is weight in the heels, and the second cue being squeeze your glutes. So the weight in the heels is often taken out of context and applied to lots of different movements. And the idea is that we're so far into our heels now that we're almost falling over backwards. So we're almost missing some weight in our toes. And this is kind of born out of the idea that we need to be in our heels almost all the time that our feet are on the ground, that we're doing, say, a movement like a squat or maybe a deadlift, right? And so the idea behind this was to encourage people who are in their toes to fall back into their heels and load their hips a little bit more during, say, a squat or maybe even a deadlift. And while that's good, well-intentioned, we find that if we take the cue a little bit too far, like we said, we almost fall over backwards and we're losing ground contact, we're losing force production into the ground. For the squeeze your glutes, this is more of an misinterpretation in that we only really squeeze our glutes when we come like out of a movement. So we're coming out of a sitting position, we're coming out of the squat position, we're coming off from the floor, pulling from the floor into to the top of a deadlift, for example. That's when we're really squeezing our glutes or squeezing our butt to kind of come up and out and straighten the legs. But after that, then you're done. When you come back down for the next rep, let's say you're coming back down from the standing position for another squat rep, then we relax the glutes. We make room to kind of sit back towards our hips so we can load those. If we squeeze our glutes, then we're tucking our hips underneath. And oftentimes that will produce a little bit more flexion or bending at the lower back. We also see this with overhead lifting. So oftentimes when we press overhead, we throw our hips forward and squeeze our glutes forward so that we can press the bar off and keep our legs straight while we're doing it. So during that overhead press, yes, we do want to keep our legs straight, but we don't want to squeeze our glutes so much that we are pushing our hips forward and leaning back as we're pressing the bar up overhead, for example. Okay, so let's go through some real-time demonstration of these, and at the end go through a little bit of a test for the weight in the heels, what we think is the best test anyways, that will tell you whether you're too far in your heels, you're too far in your toes, or what's the right balance for you as it relates to the squat movement. But this can also be applied to any pressing movement or deadlift movement or pull from the ground, any movement where you're essentially flat on the ground. Okay, so let's go do that. All right, so let's demonstrate what would a movement would look like if we are too far back in our heels. So let's say we are adopting a squat width stance. We go down for our squat, but we're really thinking about the weight in the heels. And what will tend to happen is I'll sit really far back, my shins will start to be vertical, and I'll almost play this teeter-totter game where my toes are starting to come up out of my squat. Now that's an extreme example. So what about an example where we're just biasing the back of our heels? Well, this might look like this, where my toes are still down on the ground, but I'm sinking all the way back into my heels, and all of a sudden my torso has dropped a little bit during that squat, and I don't have a forward progression into my shins, or it's very small. Okay, so all of a sudden the angle of my torso, okay, is almost parallel to the ground, and my shin angle is almost vertical. Okay? So that's essentially getting the weight too far back into the heels. Now, if we squat down and the back of our heels popping up, we might be too far on the toes. So coming back into the heels may be appropriate for you. Okay? That's when that cue, okay, will be most effectively applied. Now, if we took that and apply it to another movement, let's say a deadlift where you're pulling from the ground, okay? Too far back might be to the point where you, again, feel like you are falling over, okay? The weight might counterbalance you, but you're feeling like you're almost leaning back and pulling your chest up to try to lift the load rather than I have full weight in my toes and heels, okay? both my toes and my heels pressing the ground, and I'm pushing the floor away to stand up. So that's another way to think about your weight distribution is I have a flat foot while I pull from the ground, and I'm pushing that floor away both in my toes and my heels. Okay, that push of the floor away is what's going to really facilitate an equal weight distribution in those toes and those heels. So for the squeeze your glutes, what would that look like? Well, an extreme variation, let's say I'm overhead pressing, okay? I press overhead and I throw and squeeze my glutes, so I throw my hips forward and I press overhead like this. All of a sudden I'm leaning back, okay, in an effort to keep my legs nice and straight and locked, but I've translated my hips forward while doing that, right? Instead, hey, squeeze your legs straight, but in order to kind of counteract that, squeeze your glutes a little bit. As you press, you want to lean forward or lean into the wind, if you will. So imagine there's wind kind of blowing at you, and you're going to lean into that wind to kind of counteract any tendency to push your hips forward or squeeze those glutes. And then, second to that, when you're descending down, we'll use the squat again. For a squat, it's not that down here you really want to squeeze the glutes, it's on the way up. That's when we're using that squeeze the glutes kind of cue. But if you kind of squeeze the glutes and then try to squat and bring your hips back, you don't really sink into your hips very well. And what's happening is my hips are kind of tucked underneath, and I'm starting to get a little bit of bend through the lower back there, which is just not as optimal of a position to lift a load, let's say, if you're doing a squat. So the test that we like to do to see what your weight distribution is like for a movement where your feet is flat on the ground, so that could be a deadlift, it could be a squat, it could be a press, is the ab mat sit-up test. So the ab mat sit-up test is like so. You are taking 2 ab mats, and you're going to step 1 foot onto each ab mat. This could also be a pillow or another soft surface. It just allows you a little bit of give. Take your shoes off, so you have a little more contact at the bottom of your foot. And what you're going to do is set up in the stance that you would normally take for that movement that you plan on doing. Again, press, deadlift, squat, or any other movement that you would like to assess where your weight distribution is. Place each foot in the middle and then perform that movement. So let's say you're doing a squat. You're going to squat down, and every so often maybe pause, check that waist distribution. Am I really far back in my heels? Am I too far into my toes? And then adjust and keep going. And then reassess, keep going, reassess, and then same thing on the way back up. So you're taking a few pauses, few kind of mental checks. Okay, where's my weight distribution as I go down mostly, and then on the way back up. If I were to pick a different movement, let's say a deadlift, okay, I could start here, and then as I rise up, right, do I feel like I'm falling backwards and my toes are coming up? So ideally what we'd like to see, okay, is that we have a balanced foot as we are going through the movement. If we had to make a bias, it would maybe be towards the heels a little bit. But again, it's not so much that you feel like you can kind of wiggle your toes. So if you feel like during these movements on the ab mat here, you are wiggling your toes, you're probably a little too far into the heels at that point. You're kind of missing kind of the forefoot pressure that you could use to come up and out of a squat, up and out of a deadlift, or similar type of movement. So hopefully that is a helpful demonstration of what that would feel like and how you can assess your own self and how well you redistribute weight in your foot during those types of movements. So let us know how that went. Let us know in the comments what you felt and what made it a little bit better.